I will now recognize the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me be very clear. Donald Trump's executive order to eliminate birthright citizenship is, quote, blatantly unconstitutional. Those are not my words. Those are the words of Judge John Kuhnauer, a Reagan-appointed federal judge from my home state of Washington. The judge went on to say that while, quote, the rule of law is, according to Trump, something to navigate around or something to be ignored, whether that be for political or personal gain in the courtroom, the rule of law is a bright beacon which that judge intends to follow. For over 100 years, birthright citizenship has been enshrined as a fundamental right under the 14th Amendment. The language in the amendment is very clear. All persons born or naturalized in the United States. In fact, so clear that at least 4 federal judges have concluded that the executive order is unconstitutional. Like many of the attacks on immigrants by the Trump administration, this attack centers on old tropes that question the, quote, allegiance of immigrants. Tropes that were applied to enslaved Black people brought to this country in shackles, as well as Japanese Americans imprisoned and interned during World War II. These attacks are couched in a completely baseless argument that somehow immigrants born in the United States to a parent who is undocumented don't have sole, quote, allegiance to the United States. Professor Frost, this argument is actually very similar to the very arguments made in 1897 by Solicitor General Holmes Conrad in the Supreme Court case United States versus Wong Kim Ark, when he argued that the children of Chinese immigrants were not, quote, subject to the jurisdiction of the United States because they owed their allegiance to the Emperor of China. And the Supreme Court considered these racist arguments, and they categorically rejected them, correct? Can you explain why, if that's the case?
Yes, that's correct. I think it's worth noting that Holmes Conrad came from a slave-owning family. He was an officer in the Confederate Army, and he himself lost his citizenship for a period of time because he was a traitor to the United States of America. In addition to the argument you just noted that he made that stated that the children of immigrants, and in particular Chinese immigrants, did not have allegiance to the United States, he made that argument explicitly, and it was rejected by the Supreme Court in 1898. But in addition to that, I think it's worth noting, he also told the Supreme Court of the United States that the entire 14th Amendment was unconstitutional. That's an argument he made. I'm not aware of ever a Solicitor General making that argument to any other Supreme Court in the history of the United States. And of course, the Supreme Court rejected that as well. So that argument's been made, and it's lost 127 years ago, and it will fail again today, as it already has in front of 5 federal courts.
And at that time, the Supreme Court held that the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof was an extremely narrow qualification that only accepted 3 specific classes of persons from citizenship. So can you tell us what those 3 classes were and why they do not apply and implicate children of undocumented immigrants?
Yeah, so the Reconstruction Congress was very clear. The Supreme Court agreed in Wong Kim Ark and subsequent cases that the subject to the jurisdiction thereof language applied to 3 groups. One was the children of diplomats and consular officers, for the obvious reason that the French ambassador to the United States doesn't want their child born in the US to be a citizen, and their situation in the United States is they're representing a foreign power. In fact, the embassy itself is considered foreign territory. Native Americans, that was the only really substantive discussion the Reconstruction Congress had. At the time, they suggested this addition of the Citizenship Clause to the 14th Amendment. And they pointed out in many discussions that the Indians, Native American tribes, were sovereign powers with whom we had treaty relations, who were not subject to US law. They had their own tribal courts and laws. And at that time, they wanted to be excluded, and the Reconstruction Congress didn't want them to be automatically included. I should note that there is now a federal law that gives Native Americans automatic birthright citizenship. The final group, I'm happy to say, we've never encountered, which is enemy aliens in occupied territory.
Great. I'm gonna stop you just because I have another question here. One of the lawsuits blocking the order was brought by an individual in my state, Alicia Lopez. She was born and raised in El Salvador, but she fled the country after experiencing a violent and abusive situation. She had applied for asylum, has received a work permit while her application is pending. She's lived in Washington State since 2016. She has a 5-year-old son with her partner. She's pregnant with a second child who is due in July. I want to bring this back to the real impact of what would actually happen. Birthright citizenship has generated this deep sense of membership in our society, a collective commitment to a shared value and opportunity, equality, and contribution that's allowed America to thrive. What's the impact on real-life Americans across this country?
Yeah, to eliminate birthright citizenship would be to create a permanent underclass, a caste system, which was the very result the Reconstruction Congress intended to end.
Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady from Washington. I now recognize the committee chairman, Mr. Jordan.